Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 54th interview in this series. This series started with an interview with Lord Neuberger when we were all in lockdown on the 23rd of April last year. And who would have thought that 16 months later, swathes of Australia would still be in lockdown, and the UK and other countries in the world will still be seeing thousands of cases a day, fortunately, with less fatalities in most places today. So this interview is going to end this series, at least for the time being. So it's wholly appropriate that we end on a very high note. We've had former presidents and chief justices of Supreme and High Courts. We've had the first woman president of the International Court of Justice, and we've had many women who are very prominent in the field of international arbitration. But tonight, it's a real pleasure for me to have as my guest the first woman to be Prime Minister of Australia, and I welcome Julia Gillard. Good evening, Julia.
Hi, great to be with you.
Thank you for giving your valuable time. We have many attendees from 30 countries, and many more will watch the recording later. And most of the attendees and watchers will be lawyers, so welcome back to the world of the law, and we'll explore your involvement in that in a minute. So I like to start these interviews at the very beginning, and I discovered that you were born actually in Wales. I think that's right. And you lived there for about 5 years. Do you have any recollection of it?
No, I don't. Actually, I was in Wales last week. I took a few days off. One of the things I do now is I chair the Global Partnership for Education. We had a big replenishment conference in London. We raised over $4 billion US to support education in developing countries. So emerging from that pretty exhausted, I went with friends for a couple of days in Wales. So I've travelled to Wales a number of times during my adult life, but I don't have any recollections from being there. I was born in 1961 and we migrated in 1966. So I was 4 turning 5. So my earliest recollections are actually of being in South Australia, particularly at the migrant hostel where we first landed before my parents secured an apartment for us, and then ultimately the family home we lived in.
And why did you move to Australia? Was it to do with health?
Well, it was a mix of things. I mean, this was the generation when Australia was operating under the populate or perish sort of ethos, where it was subsidising migrants to come, particularly from the UK, the so-called £10 POMs, when you could migrate for £10 per adult. So my parents saw that there would be better economic opportunities in Australia. My mother's mother had died. My mother would not have migrated if it meant leaving her mother behind, but that sense of immediate family tie, at least on my mother's side, had moved on. And there were health reasons too. When I was a very young baby, I had a bout of bronchial pneumonia, and my parents were obviously concerned that in a cold climate that, respiratory conditions could become a real fetter on my life. And so all of it came together to make it the right decision to move to Australia.
And you moved to Adelaide, and you went to school and university in Adelaide. And that's where you joined the Labour Club, I think. Is that right?
Yes. My parents were just picking place names off a map. They didn't really know anything about Australia, and it's hard to remember what times were like back then, but it wasn't now you can feel like you've already been to a place before you get there because you do so much research online. But for my parents, this was a fair old jump into the unknown. So they were originally destined to go to Melbourne, but on the ship over, there were passengers like us, but there were also ordinary paying passengers. And amongst their number was a Welsh couple who'd made their home in Adelaide, gone back for a trip to see relatives, were on their way back to Australia again, and they befriended my family. And so we changed our destination to Adelaide. So I did grow up there. I went to the local government schools in our suburb and ended up at Adelaide University. And across all of that, particularly at university, I got involved in, the Labor stream of things, the Labor Club, Labor Party advocacy, public policy, student politics, all of it.
Yes. And then you moved to Melbourne University to do a law degree in 86 and an arts degree in 89. I want to ask you this. In the year you did law, what percentage of women were there? Can you recollect?
Look, so I started my law degree and my arts degree actually at Adelaide University. 1979, it's so long ago. And then I broke my studies because I was elected as a student political official for the Australian Union of Students. I was Education Vice President and then President. Those roles were full-time and they were done out of the Melbourne Secretariat. So that's what caused the move to Melbourne. Then I completed my degrees at Melbourne University. I don't have a clear recollection of a number in terms of women studying law, but it would have been far less than half. Whereas obviously in the contemporary age, it's more women study law than men. In my arts degree, I actually majored in economics and particularly took a number of statistical subjects, statistics itself, econometrics, subjects like that. And so they were pretty thinly populated in terms of women.
Mm. And then in 1987, you joined Slater and Gordon in Victoria, dealing in industrial law. Is that right?
Kind of. I originally joined Slater and Gordon in its commercial section. It had a small commercial practice and I joined there on the understanding that I would do around 70% commercial work and I would do the rest, the 30%, assisting in the industrial practice. But not long after I started there, both the lead practitioner in the industrial practice left. He went to the bar and the woman who was his natural successor left. She actually became a film director. She went into artistic pursuits, so well away from the law, Anna Kokonos. And so the industrial practice was, completely left adrift. And Bernard Murphy moved from personal injury to be the partner in the industrial practice, and I moved full-time onto industrial work, so law of employment work.
So you were the first woman partner at the firm?
No, I wasn't. There'd been a female partner before me out of personal injury, and the Slater and Gordon at the time had been in an era of some thrills and spills, including, some financial pressures. So the partnership had been, reconstructed on a number of occasions. So Jenny Lush from personal injury was the first female partner. I was the second female partner.
And you were partner at 29, is that right?
That's right.
Right. And did you do any industrial arbitration? I mean, we're an arbitration group, so I must ask you that question.
Yes, I did a lot of advocacy work in the Australian Industrial Relations Commission, as it then was. Now, of course, Fair Work Australia, as a result of the Fair Work Act that I got to introduce when I was Minister for Workplace Relations. So I did a lot of arbitration work under the federal law. There was still Victorian industrial law at that point. It was before the referral of industrial powers to the federal government. And so there was a practice there as well.
Mm-hmm. So you did some advocacy. I'm going to ask you later, so I might as well ask you now. Do you think all politicians ought to study advocacy?
No, I'm not a believer that there's any one pathway, any one prerequisite that credentials someone for politics. I think actually what's one of the things that's most important to our democracy is that people can come into politics from all walks of life and succeed in it. Yes, when they do the statistics regularly of who's come from where, there tends to be a large number of lawyers. But I think it's really important that people can, become politicians from being school teachers and police officers and medical practitioners and business community members and journalists and whatever else. I don't think that there's one pathway.
Well, we'll touch on that maybe a little bit later. So you went into Parliament in 1998, you were elected, and that's when you started your political career. Now, most people say when they go into politics that they went in to make a difference. And I think you can proudly say you have made a difference. But do you think most people who go into politics actually make a difference?
Yes, I do. I think, look, politics doesn't have a great reputation. Politicians don't have a great reputation. That's an observation not just about Australia, but right around the world. Trust in institutions, including the institutions of politics, is, not high. But in defence of the political class, in my experience, most people go into politics with good motivations. They actually do want to see change. It might be that they've got a broad, generalised view about the change that they'd like to see in society or the world, or they might be motivated to come into politics around one very specific policy area that is incredibly close to their heart. And I think, most people do leave a mark. Now, it mightn't be a mark at the nationally renowned level. There mightn't be, a big piece of legislation or a huge economic or social policy change that people can associate with their name. But I think most people, as a local advocate, as a member of a political team, politics ultimately is a team sport, can say that they made a contribution and a difference.
I've been an amateur politics watcher for an awful long time, and I can't recall a time when generally across the world, the level of debate has been so poor and rancorous. Don't politicians get it that voters don't really enjoy watching this sort of slapstick that goes on, particularly, when it's televised, you see a lot of it. It doesn't really wash off on the public. But why do politicians think they need to do it?
Well, one, I don't think we should over-romanticise the past. I think particularly in our very robust political culture, politicians have been trading insults for forever. And in fact, some of the most noted political moments in Australian history have been the trading of barbs in question time. And some politicians are very much remembered because they were so good at that cut and thrust. But clearly there are things that are different about today's age. And principle amongst that, I think, is the changing way in which people get information and make judgments about the world, and the changing culture we all have around what should be available to us instantaneously, where we are no longer people who are prepared to wait. The very technology we're using now means that we've got this worldview that if I want it, I can see it, I can click it, I can get it, I can, read about it. And the media culture that drives is one where people are in a fight for eyeballs. And so the nature of commentary, whether it's in traditional media that's gone online or in social media, is that, the more dramatic, the more eyeballs will go on to that story. And so, politicians are swimming in that environment, trying to get messages across in that environment. And so it tends, I think, to drive a political culture where what politicians do is ever more dramatic and ever more potential, rancorous, hard-hitting, whatever the right set of words are there. So I think we've actually got to take a step back, and I think it's easy to say bad politicians, but if you or anybody online has ever clicked on the story with the most egregious looking headline, then you are in fact a participant in this culture. And so, I think we've all got to think quite deeply about the way we get information, the information we value, how we can sort of slow the pace down in a way that gives the space that true political decision making needs.
I mean, I should ask you, why would anyone want to go into politics today and face the barrage of personal, hurtful, and at times anonymous abuse? I know it would have upset me. I mean, how did you cope with it?
Oh, look, I'm a big advocate for going into politics, and if I can reverse engineer the question, one of the things I did last year is with a great friend of mine, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is now the Director General of the World Trade Organization. She's Nigerian. She was Finance Minister and Foreign Minister of Nigeria. She and I wrote a book on women and leadership. And it is an examination of the continuing gender barriers. But when Ngozi and I did many engagements around the book, and the question would come, why go into politics? She would talk about how when she was finance minister, she got to introduce a program that enabled literally millions of women who lived a subsistence lifestyle, taking their agricultural produce to market. She was able to introduce a program that lifted them out of poverty. And so she would always then challenge the audience and say, who wouldn't want to do that? Who wouldn't want to lift 1 million, 2 million, 3 million women out of poverty? What better use of your lifetime could there possibly be than doing something like that? And I think that's the case for politics. What better use of your lifetime could there be than making the biggest possible difference?
Let me ask you about Prime Minister's questions. And it's 60 years old. The first one was 60 years ago. And Harold Macmillan's first answer was no. It's not quite as easy these days to get a yes or no out of a question. When did question time start here? Was it about the same time or a bit later?
I should know my political history well enough to answer that for you, but I don't forensically know the date. It will have been with us for basically as long as we've had the federal parliament, I suspect.
Tony Blair said it was the most anxious part of his week, and he did a lot of preparation. Did you find it onerous?
Well, I joke here in London with people interested in politics that British Prime Ministers get it easy when it comes to question time. This, only periodically having Prime Minister's question time, whereas, of course, in Australia, we do it every day that Parliament sits. When I was Prime Minister, I did it every day I was Prime Minister, an hour and a half, very hard-hitting, taking most of the questions. It's a big thing. So yes, it takes energy, preparation. It's anxious. There's a lot of adrenaline in it. Indeed, I could feel the exact moment in the walk from my office into the parliamentary chamber. I could feel the exact moment in my body that the adrenaline kicked in. And it's important to do well at it because, whether it's sensible or silly, the reality is the Canberra Press Gallery tends to judge who's up or who's down in politics based on question time performances. And there's a real kind of rally your troops sense to it that, your parliamentary team wants to feel like they've got on top in question time.
Mm. You do it. It was done every day when Parliament's sitting in Australia. I didn't know that. Every day, right?
Yes. We don't. Here you'll have Prime Minister's parliamentary questions or Health Secretary's parliamentary questions or whatever. We don't have that system. We have question time, and the unless you not that you'd be doing it now, but unless you're on, some form of official business overseas, like the Prime Minister's gone to the G20 or something like that. Other than that, you are in question time. Every minister's in question time, and every parliamentarian's in question time, and the opposition can put any question to any member of the government executive, so any minister, the Prime Minister. Usually, though, not always, but if the health secretary is under particular pressure, then perhaps, all of the questions could go to the health secretary, but usually a fair share of the questions go to the Prime Minister, and often all of the questions go to the Prime Minister.
When you were leader of the opposition, did you spend a lot of time preparing your questions?
I wasn't leader of the opposition. I was deputy leader of the opposition. But before I was deputy leader of the opposition, and perhaps more relevantly, I was manager of opposition business. So this is the counterpart position to the leader of government business. So you are the lead tactician, I guess is the right word, the lead tactician for Parliament generally, but particularly for question time. So when I held that position, manager of opposition business, that was the lion's share of my day pre-question time was preparing for question time.
I've always wondered whether it wouldn't be a good idea to have a leader of the opposition question time, because the leader of the opposition doesn't have to really say what they're going to do until their manifesto comes out, which is usually just before the election. Wouldn't it be a good thing once a month to ask them a few questions, find out what they think? It would have been nice, for instance, to know what Jeremy Corbyn's view on Brexit was by direct questions. I don't know whether they elicited an answer, but, that sort of thing. So the population.
Yeah. Look, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think it's important for however many question times you have, there aren't that many opportunities to hold a government to account in circumstances where the rules do provide that, people have to be truthful. And yes, government ministers, prime ministers make it an art form to avoid answering the question if they don't want to answer it. But I think really the balance of scrutiny has to be on those that have got their hands on the tiller. I think oppositions are exposed to lots of pressure around putting their policies out, particularly lots of media pressure. And so I'm not sure that we need a parliamentary opportunity around that.
It must be very hard to be in opposition in the middle of a pandemic when there's only one issue that's really captivating everyone's attention. It must be very hard. I suppose you can see that looking at it.
Oh, I think right around the world, I think, that we could spend all of this session talking about the huge implications of COVID for parliaments, governments, the rhythms of politics, the issues people are talking about. Obviously, it's been an extraordinary time, continues to be an extraordinary time, not only in terms of the topics that are the ones that people want to come to terms with, but the adaptation that there's needed to be in the way that parliaments are done, virtual question times and all the rest of it.
I'll come back and ask you about the future toward the end. Let me just ask you this: while you were in government, did any of your decisions or your department's decisions get subject to judicial review? And do you have any particular views about judicial review? Because in England, they're trying to cut down the number of cases that can be subject to judicial review. Judicial review is seen as an important part of the rule of law.
Look, there were celebrated times when celebrated for good or ill, but there were, a number of pivotal court cases which related to the government's agenda. There was a court case about an immigration matter dealing with refugees and asylum seekers that went to the High Court on an urgent basis. So, yes, I can recall those from my time in office. I am not familiar with the debate here in the UK around judicial review and the limits of it, so I wouldn't want to say anything about that debate. I'm simply not informed on it here in the UK, and at the end of the day, this is not my nation. I'm not a voter here, and so it's for others to work those issues through. But philosophically, whilst as someone who was in the business of politics, there are times that you will look across at the judiciary and think to yourself, why are they doing that? Why are they thinking that? I mean, it is fundamental to our system that we have that kind of accountability, that you have Parliament, you have government, you have the independent judiciary, you have free media. All of these things come together as the institutions of our democracy, and I think you've got to be very thoughtful and careful about the balance between them.
Do the lawyers ever get in your way of doing things? Your own legal team tell you couldn't do things you wanted to do?
Oh, I don't have a recollection of getting in the way. No, I mean, obviously you get good quality advice. You need good quality advice. Change proposals are sharpened by good quality advice, but I wouldn't use the terminology "get in the way."
Okay. Women in politics. I mean, in England now, I think 34% of all MPs are women. And in the House of Representatives in Australia, it's about 31%, but in the Senate, it's 53%. So things have obviously changed for the better, I'm sure, in your view, in this point. Do you think this will go on increasing? Do you think there'll be more women coming into politics?
Well, I hope so, but when you unpack the layer behind those statistics in Australia, what you find is a very differential approach between the political parties. So, I'm an Australian Labor Party member, and as long ago as the, sort of mid-1990s, Labor adopted an affirmative action target to consciously increase the number of women in Parliament. And if you'd done the stock take at that stage in the National Parliament, how many women are there? If you'd looked at the Labor side and the Conservative side, they were both in the zone of, 13, 14%, so not very many. We adopted this affirmative action target, went on a conscious program to increase the number of women. Now, federal Labor and Labor in state parliaments is around about half-half, sort of 52-48 or maybe 54-46, but, in the zone of half-half. The Conservative side of politics decided not to adopt an affirmative action target. They did decide to do some things, some women's mentoring programs and training programs and the like, but that's only enabled them to pull up their political representation to around about a quarter women. And so the big leap now needs to be made on the Conservative side of politics. And I think it's a leap that will, and I have said this before, I think it's a leap that will only be made if the Conservative side of politics thinks its way through to a comparable program like the affirmative action program, which we did on the Labor side.
How is it that the Senate has such a high representation of women and the House of Representatives is quite a lot lower?
I think it's been easier in some ways for political parties to pre-select women on the Senate side because, our Senate is elected by proportional representation by state. So political parties present a list and depending on how well you do in the election, your first candidate wins or your first two candidates win or your first three candidates win or whatever. And so political parties can shape that list to be more gender equal. Whereas, our House of Representatives, like the House of Commons, single member electorates. And so you've got to be ever more conscious and thoughtful to get a balance across single member electorates. Otherwise, everyone will just pick their local, and then when you add it all up, it adds up to not enough women.
Are there enough women judges in Australia?
There are increasingly more women judges, and famously our High Court has been very foot forward on the number of women judges. So I think we're getting there. I think there's a track record. I'm not suggesting everything's perfect, but I think there's a track record there to be quite proud of.
What area is women's representation at its lowest in the professions, do you think, that you've been able to see from your?
Oh, look, if you look right around the world, we can obviously go country by country, but if we look globally, we would say there are not enough women in politics. I mean, fully 70% of countries on earth have never had a woman lead them. And when you look at the statistics about the number of women leaders, yes, it's gone up, sort of not straight up, but up over time. But still, when you do the stock take of the more than 190 countries in the UN, routinely you'll come out with, 16 women, 18 women, 20 women, it's not anywhere near half. So we need more women in politics, and that lack of women at the leadership level is, buttressed by a lack of women at other levels, not enough women ministers, not enough women parliamentarians. When we look globally at the law, the judiciary, the statistic comes out in the mid-20s, so that's not enough women as judges. When we look at major corporations, if you pulled up any of the big lists, the big stock exchange lists of corporations, if you looked at the top 100 companies, you'd likely come out with a statistic like 5 or 6% of CEOs are women. When you go to the news media, look who's being editors of senior, of noted media outlets, whether they're newspapers or television stations, that's disproportionately men still. And I think everybody would know that the science, technology, engineering, maths area, which is making so much of our current world and the technology that we use, is still disproportionately male. So almost across the board, there is much, much more to be done.
When you were Prime Minister, were there more women judges appointed?
Yes, we appointed women judges, and we had a target for government appointments across the board. Governments appoint lots of things. We had a target of 40% women, and we delivered to that target.
I should have asked you a question earlier when we were talking about the rancorousness of politics. I was reading a biography of Robert Menzies, and I see that it says there that he used to have a drink with the leader of the opposition at the end of the day, because they were quite friendly. Would you ever imagine doing that in your day? Or was it ever done recently?
Oh, look, the answer is yes and no. It's not the same as, nothing's the same as Robert Menzies' era. Australia is a big country. And, in Robert Menzies' era, people used to load into Canberra for extended periods of time, for weeks and weeks and weeks, because you couldn't be you couldn't hold a federal electorate in Perth and pop to Canberra and then pop back. There was no popping. If you were going to go and make that very onerous, very long journey, then you would go and you would stay for weeks and weeks. And so the whole atmosphere of politics was different, because people loaded into Canberra for a long period of time. They'd stay for weekends. There would consequently be more, socialising, more flexibility. Whereas in the modern era, people fly into Canberra. This is obviously outside COVID, but fly into Canberra on a Sunday night or a Monday morning, sprint to get back to their electorates on a Thursday night, maybe a Friday morning. and the days that you are there are intense, long days, working well into the night. So, the whole logistics atmosphere is different. Having said that, when I was Prime Minister and in the jobs I held before I was Prime Minister, there would be many occasions where you would be doing a bipartisan thing with your, opposite number from the other side of politics, and you would do it together in a perfectly, civilised way. I've obviously had my very key disputes with Tony Abbott, but over many long years, when he was Minister for Health, I was Shadow Minister for Health. When I was Prime Minister, when he was Opposition Leader, there would be key bipartisan occasions where we would do things together. We appeared on a television show every Friday. This is before I was Prime Minister, but for many years. So, you did know each other in that sense, as well as not every moment is like the question time moments.
What are we going to do in the world about this terrible problem about misinformation that's spread through social media? What can be done to control it? Because it's causing an awful lot of problems.
I wish I had that answer. If I had that answer, I most assuredly would be sharing it, but I don't. I think there are some things that we need to think about in terms of social media companies and what content they do or don't allow to be posted. I think there's also a big issue to think through in terms of anonymity. Why is it that you can intersect with Twitter or whatever, Facebook, and remain anonymous, whereas if you were going to, in the old days, send a letter to the editor in the newspaper, then you'd have to use your proper name and address, and they might well check that up before they chose to publish it. So I think there's all of those things to think through.
That point. Well, why haven't government said that you have to give your name, address, telephone number, and email address if you want to tweet?
Well, because these are global companies, and your legislative competence, it's not as simple as that. Sorry, I didn't hear you.
All got together. All the governments have got together to tax.
But then the all got together is, and I don't. Once again, I think it's easy to go, silly politicians, why don't they do X or Y or Z? I think it's more complicated than that. These are global corporations with huge power that are capable of having major disputes with national governments. We've seen examples of that around the world. There was an example in Australia. This is, an age in which, coming together multilaterally has never been an easy project, and it's not an easy project today. We've seen some collaboration between governments on social media regulation. It would be wrong to say that there's been none. So, look, I think there's a lively debate to be had here, but it's, there are a number of technical and difficult questions, as well as political will questions to work through. So, look, I think there's all of those things to think about. But even if we solved all of those things, we're still in an age where the intersection with social media means people can get into information bubbles where what they're seeing is not the truth, but it becomes self-reinforcing. There would be people whose only information about the pandemic and about the veracity of vaccines, for example, has come from websites and information sources which are not driven by science. They're driven by prejudice against vaccines. Now, how you deal with that, other than, community information, teaching people about what is, how to judge, what is credentialed information versus just people spouting off, the critical thinking skills that are needed for that, very difficult, but it's that we have to think our way through.
So you left politics when you were no longer prime minister, and you've had a pretty busy and fruitful time ever since. You're doing a lot of things. So let's just see what you're doing. The Wellcome Foundation, you're now chairman of that?
Yes, so the things that have brought me to London for this trip, in a number of years ago, going back about 4 years, I worked with King's College London to create a global institute for women's leadership, and the Global Institute's going well. We're opening a sister institute at the Australian National University. So we're a research institute that is looking at all of the barriers that prevent women coming through for leadership in all walks of life, and the barriers right back to the entry points, you know, every moment in a woman's working life journey where she's treated differently or an extra hurdle is put in her way based on her gender. So we, you know, that work, obviously I was able to continue virtually, but it is nice to be back with the team, able to see them, you know, from time to time in person, and to be in the time zone continuing that work. So that's number one. Number two, in April this year, I commenced as chair of the Wellcome Trust, which is one of the largest philanthropic funds in the world that supports health and medical research, with a long-term focus on infectious diseases. So, you know, not too many things that are more important than that right now in human history. But under our strategic plan, we're also focused on discovery science and two other areas very important to our shared future, diseases and health conditions exacerbated by climate change and mental health. Then thirdly, I came to London because I have served for a long period of time now. I'm coming to the end of it, but I've served for a long period of time as the chair of the multilateral fund called the Global Partnership for Education, which supports school education in developing countries. And 2 weeks ago, we had our replenishment conference co-hosted by Prime Minister Johnson and the President of Kenya, President Kenyatta, to raise funds for our next 5 years of work. And we raised just over $4 billion of funds, which is well on our way to our 5 billion target.
That's amazing. And where did all those funds come from? From governments or from?
Mainly from governments through their overseas development assistance programs, but increasingly we are attracting funding from private philanthropy, and we also do some partnerships, interesting partnerships with the private sector.
Well, as an ex-King's lawyer myself, I must ask you why you chose King's.
Well, King's, I was invited at this stage. The principal of King's, the leader of King's, was Ed Byrne, who's, you know, part Aussie, part UK. He was born here. He moved to Australia as a teenager. He's a neuroscientist, and his career in leading universities has brought him back and forth on several occasions between the UK and Australia. He led Monash University when I was Minister for Education. I dealt with him, and Prime Minister. I dealt with him a lot then. You know, Monash University is a huge university in Australia. I think the biggest by student size in Australia. And he came to London to lead King's College. He invited me to do a visiting professorship there, which I did in the Policy Institute. And since writing my memoir, where I tried to write thoughtfully about gender and leadership, I had thought to myself that it would be good if there was a much more dedicated focus on research in this area. And so I did the visiting professorship in the Policy Institute and thought this is exactly the kind of outwards facing culture that would be needed to make an institute of the sort that I had in mind work. And so I put the idea to King's College, and I'm very grateful that they said yes to supporting it.
Of course, they're right in the heart of London, legal London, financial London, political London. It's a very good position. Yeah, good
That's
choice.
Yes, very good choice.
in politics, what would you say is your greatest achievement? Which policy that you've got through gives you the greatest satisfaction looking back on it?
Look, I always find it incredibly hard to pick one, but I am very proud of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. By the standards of the world, Australia's got a very good healthcare system, but a big underdone piece was support for Australians with major disabilities, and the scheme that we introduced has absolutely changed that. It's already benefiting tens of thousands of Australians and will, over the years to come, benefit many millions of Australians. So I'm very proud of that. I am also very proud of calling the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse. We needed to have a national reckoning with the way in which children had been abused and ill-treated in institutions, and the Royal Commission achieved that. I think it's helped heal some hurt and trauma, and it set us on a pathway to keep children safer in the future. I'm also very proud of the education reforms, you know, right back to my student union days. I was on a mission to see better opportunity and better education in Australia, and we made a big difference to those things.
Now, you've had a very busy life in politics. I mean, do you have any hobbies outside of politics?
Oh, well, I'm a big reader, and my contemporary life gives me more opportunity to read for pleasure than I had when I was directly in politics. I continued to read when I was in politics, but hours were short. So I get to read more things now, which I very much enjoy. And
read this.
Here you go.
You read this book. It's all about Doc Everett and a particular.
Doc Everett. Yep, very famous and noted Australian. So I'm glad to see you're reading that book. You know, I'm a big reader. I obviously enjoy spending time with a family when I'm in Australia, with friends when I'm here in the UK. I enjoy getting out and doing walks, and so that's what took me to Wales last week. So they're kind of the hobbies and the outside pursuits.
Are you living a normal life in London now that the restrictions have gone? You go out?
I mean, it's mixed. I'm not sure this word normal is ever going to quite sit with us the same way again. Working where I do at the Wellcome Trust, I am able to go to the office. I do go to the office. But the office hasn't fully reopened yet. It will fully reopen post the sort of summer season here. Obviously, as you would know, August is a big holiday season. So rather than try and do a reopening before the holiday season, the judgment was taken to do the big reopening after the holiday season. King's College has continued on virtual work. Though as the new academic year rolls around in September, it will move to a more face-to-face rhythm. So work is not normal, if I can use that terminology, of getting up and going to a workplace every day. A lot of it is still conducted the way we're doing this now. In terms of moving around London, though, you know, as I think people would see from the media reports, you know, generally things are open. There's still the requests for people to continue to wear masks on public transport, when shopping, when in restaurants, except when you're actually eating, you know, those sorts of things. So it's a different version of normal than the London you would have known pre-pandemic.
So what do you think the future holds for us all? I mean, assuming that we get the vaccinations up to a level where we can do, everyone can do what they're doing in London, hoping working in England. I mean, what ultimate change, what major changes do you think will be? I mean, in our business, in international arbitration, most cases now are being done like this, and it's working pretty well. But we're lucky we can go on doing this, but there's some things we can't do. I mean, how is it going to affect, you know, the role of women, for instance? Is it going to be a boost to them more work can be done at home and things like that. What
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question, and the truth is we don't know yet. I can see sort of two very different futures from here. One future would, but the happy version of the future would be one where the pandemic has reinforced in us the value of caring work. At the end of the day, who's got us through the pandemic is people on the front lines of health services in the UK, the NHS. And I think people have realised that, people have stood and clapped for carers and those sorts of things, showing their appreciation. But we need to move that now into a recognition that those caring professions are often under-rewarded and undervalued, because historically they've been women's work, disproportionately done by women. So I think one future we would systemically address that. Second, in the happy version of the future, we would take, for those occupations where this technology is relevant, obviously that's not all occupations, some have to be done in person, but for those occupations where this kind of technology is relevant, we would find a balance between virtual and in-person working, which makes work and family life issues easier. And that would be better for everyone. But given it is women who disproportionately do caring work at home, it would be particularly better for women. The negative view of the future I see is one where we haven't learned the lessons about caring, and we aren't thoughtful in the use of this technology. So in many workplaces, employers allow people to exercise options, which sounds good on the surface, but what ends up happening is that the men disproportionately go back to the office, the women disproportionately work from home, the women are less visible, less valued, less likely to be promoted, less likely to be offered the important training opportunities, less likely to be mentored, and all the rest of it. So which of those futures we end up in, I think, is still to play for, if I can use that terminology.
I mean, I'm very concerned about the effect it's having on children. My grandchildren here in Australia, they miss so much school. And, if this is going to go on and on, we're building up a real problem for the future. I mean, how are we going to deal with that?
Well, I agree with you that from all sorts of perspectives, lost educational time, mental health, this is a very concerning era. My window on it now is more through the mental health lens, because I chair Beyond Blue, which of course is so well known in Australia and provides support and services to people who, need to reach out. And we certainly see that our support line, we've got a telephone support line as well as ways of engaging online, as we are doing. But we see the needs absolutely spike around lockdowns. There's real senses of sort of fatigue out there, of separation, of anxiety about what's going to happen next. And so there are some very big things we need to think about in terms of supporting people now, but also as we hopefully get to a stage where the pandemic is in the rear vision mirror, how we, enable people to overcome what may be mental health concerns that continue to press on them out of this time.
Are you still against the euthanasia, or have you changed your mind?
I've never been against euthanasia.
Right, somewhere I read that you were, so you need to correct that.
No, look, I like other people. I think it's it's one thing to be conceptually in favour of euthanasia, which I am. It is another thing to figure through all of the safeguards and workings, which mean that this affords people the right to die with dignity, but is not open to abuse. I think some of the state governments, particularly point to the Victorian government, have worked their way through these things very well.
I should have asked you this. You had some interaction with Hillary Clinton. How did you get together with Hillary? Because I saw you do an interview, a double act at King's College. I watched it. How did that sort of come about? And are you still working with her?
Yes, well, I got to know Hillary because she was Secretary of State. President Obama was my counterpart when I was Prime Minister, and Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. She was a very frequent visitor to our region of the world. It was at the time that President Obama's strategic outlook was the pivot to Asia, was the terminology. And so Hillary was the face of that pivot in Asia, the Asia Pacific. So I got to know her then. In my post-political time, I've worked with her on a variety of causes, including girls' education. I was a very big supporter of hers. I wanted to see her elected. Not that I had a vote in the United States, but wanted to see her elected in 2016. Unfortunately, that was not to happen. And we've collaborated on a number of things since about women's leadership and women's empowerment, of which the King's College conversation was one. So yes, I'm going to look forward to continuing to collaborate with her on these issues, which are so close to her heart.
We haven't mentioned climate change. Silly question to ask where you stand on climate change, because sure, in a sense, we all feel the same way in different degrees. How do you handle the climate change deniers who, will not accept that there's anything in the science that's been produced so far?
Well, my government introduced an economy-wide emissions trading scheme. We put a price on carbon, and what the emissions track record of Australia undoubtedly shows, is that emissions went up, apart from the period of operation of our emissions trading scheme where they started to trend down. The Conservative government came into office, abolished the scheme, and they started to go back up. Obviously, there will have been a pandemic effect because of everything that's happened with travel and the like. As a result of the pandemic, but there's not an economy-wide system in Australia now like our emissions trading scheme. So, I'm obviously a huge advocate of action on climate change, of being guided by the science. I'm a huge advocate. I wouldn't be at the Wellcome Trust unless I understood the importance of science and evidence to public policy decision-making. I think it's a bit like the arguments around vaccine hesitancy and the like. You will probably get a proportion of the population that will never be convinced, and no amount of research, no amount of evidence, no amount of reason will change their minds. Then you get people who, a larger section of the population, people who may start with predispositions against, but who are persuadable. And, then you've got people who are persuaded and want to see change. If we look at climate, I think the percentage of people who are persuaded and want to see change is going up. There still remains a section that is persuadable, and politics needs to concentrate on them in order to get, the critical mass for action. And around the world, don't want to be drawn on individual countries' policies, but around the world in many places, we're seeing that there is a critical mass for action and people are acting.
What advice would you give to men or women who want to go into politics?
Well, the most important piece of advice I could give to anybody is be clear about the why question. Why do you want to go into politics? Ultimately, it's not an easy pathway. There are many stresses and strains on you as an individual, on your family. There are easier jobs. And so if you aren't sustained by a sense of purpose about why you want to be in politics, then I think you'll find the journey an even harder one, and you'll find it more difficult to stay on course.
Right. Seems to me that you have a very interesting life post politics. Do you feel more relaxed in what you're doing now than you were when you were in politics? You find it?
I wouldn't. I mean, not more relaxed in what I'm doing. I wouldn't use that terminology. I mean, I love being in politics. It's for others to judge, but I think I thrived in politics. But it's personally thrived in politics. But it's, no one would describe it as a relaxing lifestyle. I mean, it's clearly not a relaxing lifestyle. I mean, the pace of work is relentless. And the quicker the media cycle, the more relentless the pace of work. But, I mean, I felt comfortable in my own skin and comfortable in the roles that I pursued in politics. I, now in this period of my life, feel once again comfortable in, there's always things to learn, always, ways of challenging yourself, but I feel, comfortable and happy in the things that I'm doing. Obviously, whilst I continue to work hard, the pace is not the sheer relentlessness that the senior echelons of politics had.
It seems to me, I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me if you're prime minister of a major country, or maybe all countries, you hardly have a minute to yourself. I mean, was that right? Was something happening all the time? Did you get any free time? Because things happen so quickly today with instantaneous news coverage. There's always something coming up on your plate.
Yeah, no, it's hard. It's hard. And I mean, you have to find the, I'm going to say tricks. I'm not sure tricks is the right word, but you have to find the methods for making it sustainable, as sustainable as possible. So, you do need to find a formula for working very, very hard with very little time off. You need to be good at decompressing in the very short amount of time that you get off. You've got to try and find the ways of, physically recovering, getting some exercise, getting some sleep. But it takes a toll on people. Periodically they do those, before and after shots of people who have served as President of the United States. I mean, that's a regular media feature in the US, and, you can see the toll it takes on people. And then sometimes they produce a photo of them, 4 years after they finish being president. They look better then, even though they're 4 years older, they look better then than they did on the day they finished being president. So we'd be naive to say it doesn't take a toll. It does.
Well, Julia, thank you very much for your time and a wide-ranging discussion. Very kind of you to give so generously of it. And a great thanks to all the viewers and listeners. Although I can't see you, I do know who's signed up for all these things. Thanks for all those regular viewers who watch and listen every week. So goodbye, Julia. Thanks very much again. Have a nice summer, and goodbye to everybody else for the moment. Take care and stay well, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.